On today's episode, we're going to be looking into the relations of the most famous kingdoms and commonwealths throughout the world. This is a book that comes to us from 1608, so this is going to provide to us an excellent view on exactly what the people in the 1600s were being taught about Tartaria. The original book is by Giovanni Botero, and it was written in the 1600s at some point, or possibly in the late 1500s, and it was translated by a man called Robert Johnson from Latin into English for 1608, so that's when the translation comes out. Before we begin, just a little bit of background on the original author. Giovanni Botero was born around 1544. He was an Italian thinker, priest, poet, and diplomat, and an author of a few books. At the age of 15, he was sent to a Jesuit college, so he was a Jesuit, and a year later he moved to the Roman college, where he was introduced to some of the most influential Catholic thinkers of the 16th century. In 1565, Botero was sent to teach philosophy and rhetoric at the Jesuit colleges in France. After spending the 1570s drifting from one Jesuit college to another, he was actually discharged from the Jesuit order in 1580 after giving a doctrinally incorrect sermon where he questioned the Pope's temporal power. So whilst yes, he was a Jesuit, he was actually kicked out of the Jesuit order for questioning the Pope's power. So that might be an important factor to consider when reading his work. So now we'll delve into the book and we're going to see what it says exactly about Tartaria. Now this is the book itself. Obviously it's copied to archive. I'll put a link in the description so you can come and see it for yourself. This is, like I said, a translation from Latin into English, and it seems to have been done for the Right Honourable Edward Earl of Worcester, Lord of Sheptol Ragland. So he required this book translating, and this is the translation. So we're going to have a look now. We jump to page 223. And this is in the Asia section. It comes right after Moscovia. So if you want to learn more about the Moscovians, because obviously it does go into the Tartars that lie in that area, we're going to ignore that today. But if you'd like to go and see that, you can do. It talks about the Crim Tartars, the Nogay tribe, the Chersonesus tribes, etc. So it does talk a lot about that. If you want to see that, go and have a look. Or if you're interested, we could look at it in the future, but I don't think it's too necessary. We've covered a lot of the topics on this channel before. If you're interested, go and see. So we start on page 223, where it's talking about Tartaria. We can see that Tartaria at the top there. And we're going to see what it has to say. It is written, like I said, in a very Old English manner, which isn't very friendly to the eyes. If you're a modern reader in particular, there's an overabundance of commas and short sentences that they don't really flow very well, and it's not very nice to read or listen to. So I'll do my best to phrase it in a way that sounds better for you. So it starts off by saying that the kingdom of the Tartars is the fairest and greatest principality through the whole world, whenas besides the portion which lieth in Europe, it containeth more than a third part of Asia. Of course, that's referring to Little Tartary, lying in Europe. So we'll carry on. It says, in it are contained three famous and principal provinces, Sarmatia Asiatica, both Scythias, and the regions of Serica, now called Cathay. So again, we've talked about this multiple times on the channel. Cathay is an old word for China, but it actually comes from the Khitan Empire, who ruled north of China and eventually took over China for a period before the Jin dynasty took over from them, and then the Mongols took over the entire place. So the Khitans became known as the Chinese because they were in charge of northern China and they took control of portions of land beyond the wall. So when they were introduced to Europe, the Chinese became known as the Cathayans, and that has bred a lot of confusion. Still to this day, there are arguments over whether Cathay was a real place or not, and the general consensus is no, that it was just referring to parts of northern China. We'll discuss it on another video. I've done other videos on this, so you can go and watch them if you want to talk more about that. It is a very interesting topic. It's essentially a very hidden country, but it relates to this Khitan Empire. So, what does it mean by both Scythias? If you know, pause the video and let me know in the comments, but it basically means Scythia extra Imau and Scythia inter Imau. They used to divide Scythia by the Imaean or Imau Mountains, which are now considered to essentially be the line between the Altai and Himalayas. Everything east of these mountains was considered extra Imao, and everything to the west was inter Imao. Now it says, most fierce and barbarous nations did always inhabit this country, as first the Amazons, a warlike kind of women, which in their days, casting away the properties of their sex, vexed the whole world, usurped Asia, and built Ephesus, or Ephesus. So that's talking about the Amazonians, which of course Wonder Woman is based on the original Amazonian women, which were supposedly Scythian women that conquered Asia, and as it says, doing away with their sex, casting away the properties of their sex, saying, hey, we might be women, but we're stronger than you, because I have a sword. Upon their final extirpation arose the Scythians, no less dreadful than the former. So of course the Scythian Empire was huge. We still today see Scythian gold, that we find Scythian gold, and the only thing I can say about this Scythian gold is magnificence. You need to see the quality of this gold. The production is unmatched for that time period in particular. Gold crafting, the smelting, the technique of the people doing that stuff is beyond anything. So that's something we will look into at some point in the future. They were succeeded by the Goths, or Getes, termed by their neighbours Paluchi, that is, ravenous or thievish. And then, of course, the Goths, which supposedly came from many hundreds years before. We're talking the fall of Rome. We'll get into this in a second as well, because they do seem to name the Goths down here as being around in about 1211-ish, which doesn't really match what we consider today. We consider the Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, who have been around 400, 500 AD. These, the Tartars, tamed and erected their monarchy about the year of our Lord, 1187, or as others say, 1162. Now, I might be wrong, but I believe 1162 is considered the birth of Genghis Khan. So, unsure on what the exact circumstances on that date difference by 25 years. Was it that he was 25 when he was elected, and they're considering his birth? Possibly. As it says here, electing for their king, one Kingus, a man of base birth and calling. This man's followers at that time lived without manners, law, or religion in the plains of Karakorum. Now today, Karakorum is considered Karkarin. We can see the ruins of that in Mongolia. They tended their cattle and paid their duties to King Uncham, otherwise Prester John. Again, Prester John, we've talked about this a lot on the channel. Prester John, sometimes confused with the king in Ethiopia. There's a lot to go into there, so we'll have to make our own video on that particular subject. But if you want to see a bit more, go and watch the Gog Magog video, because that includes a lot of information, and the Plains of Barju video. Both of those include a lot of information on this, and what we'll talk about in a second, which is Ten Duck. So we can see here it says that Prester John, who without doubt in those days kept his court in Ten Duck in the kingdom of Argun. So again, go watch those videos if you want to see more about this, but I deduce using some research that the name Ten Duck comes from a yurt, which is what the Mongolians obviously used as their transportable houses, and they used that as prayer to Tengri, and the Ten Duck was a symbol for Tengrism. And the kingdom of Argun is located most likely around the Argun River in Manchuria/Russia today. So we pretty much pin that one down to exactly where that kingdom would have been, which is great. It's definitely not Ethiopia, but go watch those videos if you want to see more about that. And it says this king Chinggis first subdued the kingdom of Uncham, and he afterwards imposed the yoke and subjection on the bordering provinces. So of course it's talking about the rise of Genghis and his original Tartarian or Mongolian Empire. And then he goes on to talk about this, which is quite interesting, and without question, that famous comet seen in the month of May 1211, so 1211 AD, in May, a famous comet was seen that lasted 18 days, and glimmering on the Goths, Tanai, and Russia, with its tail extended towards the west, and it did foreshadow the succeeding inundation of these Tartars. So it's trying to say that a comet came in 1211 in May that lasted 18 days, and it came foreshadowing this inundation of Tartars into these regions, because of course the expansions under Batu Khan and other children of Genghis and subsequent Khanates. For in the year following, this nation, whose name was not so much as dreamt of before in Europe, wholly subdued Sarmatia Asiatica or Scythia, invaded Russia, Hungary and Polonia, and lastly erected other famous monarchies in China, Mine and Bengala. So of course it's talking about Genghis Khan's sudden rush. They didn't even know about the Tartars before this, and then suddenly the Tartarians had taken over all this area and it was now theirs. So at this day, it is divided into 5 principal provinces. So again, by this day, it's the late 1500s or early 1600s, and it's divided into 5 provinces. Tartaria Minor, which is lying in Europe between the Tanai and Borysthenes. So of course we know this. This is Little Tartary, very famous. The next section is called Tartaria Deserta, which is of old Sarmatia Asiatica, and it contains most of the hordes, but not all. Now remember, the word horde doesn't mean exactly what you think it does. It's not as barbarian. It comes from the word order, O-R-D-A, essentially like a military unit. They're kind of like a standing army, and they had a thing called a blood tax, which meant they took like 20% of your men who joined the army, and they were conscripted into the army for life. So it was their job to be in the army for life, and they'd go around subduing people that didn't pay their taxes, was essentially their job as the horde. They'd go around the different regions of Tartaria, making sure every country paid their taxes. The other sections, of course, we've talked about Tartaria Minor, Tartaria Deserta, so that's 2. Zagathe is the 3rd, otherwise known as Chagatai, the Chagatai Khanate today. Cathay is the 4th, so again, we talked about that before. And lastly, the Great Promontory, which lieth outstretched in the furthest part of Tartary towards the north and east, and may be called Tartaria Antiqua. So you can see here, Antiqua, the ancient Tartary, the original Tartary, which it says on the next page, as the mother place of the true Tartar nation, utterly unknown to Ptolemy. So they did seem to think in this time that it was very far northeast. They talked about it being very cold. Some people spoke about there being periods of perpetual night, which might refer, of course, to the very far regions of the Arctic Circle. Might be referring to those regions during winter, of course, when essentially no light gets up there. So it now goes into some of the areas. It seems to only name 3, which is Tartaria Minor, Tartaria Deserta, and then Astrakhan. Astrakhan, of course, being one of the cities now in Russia. It was the seat of the Astrakhan Khanate, and it was the seat of the actual Golden Horde for a period after the destruction of their actual capital called Saray in about 1480. So starting with Tartaria Minor, it says, the Precapensis live in the open field about the Euxine Sea, the lake of Meotis, and the Taurica Chersonnesus, which adjoineth upon Borysthenes and Tanai in Europe. In this strait or peninsula standeth Theodosia, now Kaffa, once a colony of the Genoese, now a sanguinary of the Turks. Now, of course, that makes sense, the connections between the Crimean Tatars, the Crimean Tatar Khanate, and the Turkish and the Ottomans that succeeded. The Turks, of course, being subdued originally by Tamerlane himself, and Turks supposedly being Tatar originated. If you watch the last video where we were talking about the Tartaria files, lots of indications there that the Turks were actually born of the Tatars, so that's quite curious. But their whole territories are very fruitful for corn and cattle, so yeah, it just talks about the territories there, and it says they are sworn enemies to the Christians, yearly invading Russia, Lithuania, Wallachia, Polonia, and many times Muscovia, and yielding unto the Turks in the name of tribute every year 300 Christian souls. So they had to give 300 Christian slaves or souls to the Turks that they'd kidnapped from these regions. To one of these princes, Selmus gave his daughter in marriage. So Selmus gave one of his daughters to marry a prince of the Tartar Crimean Khanate. So I'm not sure if this is a spelling mistake or if it's something I've not heard of before, but here it says Sarmatia Asiatica, I'm pretty certain it should be Sarmatia Asiatica, so we'll presume that's just a typo, but we'll see. In the old times it was called Sarmatia Asiatica and better inhabited before the coming of the Tartars. So before the Tartars came, this area was better inhabited. It lieth between the Tanai, the Caspian Sea, and the Lake of Kitay. Now this is interesting because the Lake of Kitay, there's so much debate on where this is. Some people say it didn't exist, some people say it's Teleskoi Lake, some will say that it was actually China and that the authors and geographers, etc., were just completely incorrect. But it's a very interesting notion. We'll do an entire video on this, on the Lake of Kitay, because it could be many locations. But it lieth between the Tanay, the Caspian Sea, the Lake of Kitay, and a plain country, by nature fertile, and it was manured by the Tartars, who live a very similar life to the Arabians around here. So again, makes sense because the Arabians are further south. So the rest just talks about the land, doesn't really need to be talked about too much, not very interesting, just talks about the Tartars living like the Arabians. And then down in Astrakhan, it talks about it being situated upon the Caspian Sea. It's rich, affordeth excellent good salt, and very well frequented by Muscovites, Turkish, Armenian, and Persian merchants. In the year 1494, now this is curious, it was taken by John Basilides, Great Duke of Muscovia, and by him with the title thereof annexed to the Muscovian Empire. Now this is curious because today we consider Astrakhan to have fallen in about 1556, I believe, to Ivan the Terrible, which is Ivan Vasilovich IV. Now this John is Ivan Vasilovich III, is supposed to be Ivan the Great, the one that defeated the Golden Horde in 1480, which I talked about before, destroyed the capital of Saray, and then they moved it to Astrakhan for a bit. So there's a very curious bit of history here that seems to be confused because this does not jive with official history. Unless anyone would like to correct me in the comments, more than happy to be corrected, but as far as I can work out, this doesn't really jive with official history. But we'll move on. The Zagatean Tartars were so named of their prince, the brother of the great Sham, so Zagatay, which once reigned amongst them. They are now called Hyasolbus, that is to say, green heads of the colour of the Dulipans. So I have no idea what that's talking about, going to be honest. But they inhabit the ancient countries of Bactria, Sogdiana, and Margiana. Now, I do understand that.
I understood that reference.
In times past, the habitation of the Massagetsis, so famous in arms. These are the most honourable people of the Tartars, indifferent, civil, given to arts, and lords to many of fair cities built with stone, as Samarkand, which is Samarkand. Once a town of great fame and excellency, but now in these days is decayed. Now, the next section talks about the Great Sham. Now, of course, the Great Sham is the one that is supposedly in charge of this entire empire. Let's learn a little bit about him. As our ancestors were ignorant of the regions situated upon the east side of the Caspian Sea, so it is saying our ancestors were ignorant before this of the nations and regions situated on the east of the Caspian Sea, which they imagined to be a branch of the ocean, and that's very true. That's why we see the Scythian Ocean supposedly placed on that portion. I mean, unless something's happened to the land, some people suggest there's been some kind of cataclysm. Others suggest it's because it was frozen over, whereas old world history seems to suggest it's just we hadn't been there, so it's up to you to make up your own mind about that. But even so, as yet little or nothing knoweth this age what regions lie, or what people inhabit beyond that sea, and the mountains commonly called Delangua and Ufont. So I've just done a quick research and I found this for the Delangua Mountains. So we can possibly work out where those exactly were anyway. So at first I had no idea, but that's where they were. So it says that Marco Polo was the first to describe these countries, and of him we received what we know of the Tartars. So everything we know really comes from him. The great distance of countries, the difficulty of the journey, and the inaccessible situation of places hath hindered the discovery of those provinces, and the great Duke of Muscovy, by whose dominions we may easiest travel thither, will suffer no strangers to pass through his kingdom. So it's saying that the Duke of Muscovy, the King of Muscovy, essentially, Emperor of the Russians at this point, I think, the first Tsar, you know, he was definitely the Tsar of Russia at this point, he would not allow anyone to come through his land. That's why people couldn't get any further. And of course the Russians were moving themselves east. So it does explain a lot. They were invading that way. So then it just talks about the difficulty of getting there by other passages. So if you can't go through Muscovy, the Caspian Sea is quite horrible. By way of Persia is infinite mountains and vast deserts dividing both provinces. And to the further hindrance of this discovery, neither the Great Sham, neither the King of China, nor the Duke of Muscovy will suffer any of their subjects to travel out of their dominions, nor any strangers to enter in, unless he come as an ambassador. Neither, in this case, it is lawful for him to converse freely or range at his pleasure. So, of course, the Chinese, the Grand Sham of Tartary, and the Duke of Muscovy, They won't let visitors in, and they won't let their own people out. We know that in the later years, the reason they wouldn't let people in is because they didn't want us giving them opium. So I wonder what the motivations were at this point in the 1600s. They do live under diverse princes, the principal whereof and those that wear green on their turbans. These do inhabit Samarkand, and are at continual enmity with the Persians. Next are those of Bokhan, Mahometans, then those of Magor, and of course Magor, obviously referring to Magog or Mongolia, of whom you shall hear hereafter, and lastly those of Cathay, whereof we now entreat. So Cathay, of course, they say it's China, but why is China a separate thing? Why is Cathay a separate thing? And he's saying we're now entreated with the Cathayans. They are definitely different things. We can see Cathay, China, and the Sham is the lord of Cathay. So never was there any nation upon the face of the earth that enjoyed a larger empire than they do, or have undertaken haughtier exploits. So turning to the next page, we see that Marco Polo writeth that this people once inhabited Kinaja, I'm really not sure what that one's saying, Kinaja, and Barja possibly being like Barju, maybe, provinces situated upon the Scythic Ocean, without city, castle or house, wandering like Arabians from place to place, according to the season of the year. So the Scythic Ocean, this is the confusion I was talking about before. If you look at the old maps, they seem to believe the Scythic Ocean started a lot lower than it did. It's also called the Frozen Ocean, so people have hypothesized maybe it's because the land had been frozen over, like Siberia had, been hit by perpetual snow, particularly during the Little Ice Age, perhaps, and that has contributed to people looking at it and going, that's the ocean, but that doesn't really make sense. So let me know what you think about the Scythic Ocean down below. We'll have to talk more about that in future, because we'll need to crack on to get this done. Got a few more pages to go through, so I'll try and skim for the best information from this point on. And it talks again, obviously, they before acknowledged Uncham, who some interpreters pressed to John, for their sovereign lord, to whom they gave the 10th of their cattle. So this was a procedure. It was kind of like the blood tax I talked about. You'd give like 10% of something, and that was your tax, that was your tribute. You just give 10% of everything every year to the Sham, and that was your payment to be part of the empire, essentially. And 10% of your men, or 20%, whatever it was, to join the armies. And that's how they kept up the perpetual forces to keep the place safe. This forced conscription of about 10 to 20% of every village's male population. Think of it what you will, I think it seems like a very good method for the time. It's not something I'd promote today, but at the time it seems very good. But it then says that in the process of time, they multiplied so much that Uncham, being jealous of their neighborhood, began to lessen their number and their forces by sending them just to random places, just on desperate voyages or random assaults across the world, because he just wanted to get rid of their men, because he was thinking, whoa, there's too many people here, they're gonna take over soon. I've also heard other stories which was to do with the jinn and Uncham's men having untoward relations with the married women of the camps that they visited, because when you visited, you were expected to give like a free woman, a single lady, to provide a single lady for your guest. Whereas these guys were turning up like, no, I want that, I want your wife. And they couldn't do anything about it, and apparently that angered these people, and they were like, right, we need to do something about this. But those are just stories. So it says that when they got a chance, they assembled themselves and went far beyond their own borders, removed themselves from the borders of Uncham, so he wouldn't know how many they had. So they kept going out there and building up their forces. And then after doing this for so many years, they elected Genghis Khan as their king to guide this army. This Genghis departing from his own territories in the year of our Lord 1162, so this would believe that he was departing from his own territories, not born in 1162, but departing from his territories, with a most fearful army, subdued partly by force, partly by the terror of his name, 9 provinces. So he subdued these 9 provinces, and at last, being denied the daughter of Uncham in marriage, he made his war upon him, and overcoming him in battle, he cast him out of his kingdom. So Genghis has finally, after uniting these 9 provinces under his banner, he's defeated Uncham, and then he's kicked him out of his own kingdom and taken the dude's daughter as his wife. Other stories say that Uncham willingly gave the daughter, and he became a good father-in-law or something to Genghis, but again, differing stories. But in this one, he was kicked out of his kingdom. Presumably, it doesn't mention it, but presumably Genghis did then marry his daughter. So after the death of Genghis, his successors afflicted Europe. So obviously they went on to take the sections of Europe, and it describes that in 1212, they drove the Polisoks from the banks of the Euxine Sea. In the year 1228, they spoiled Russia. In 1241, they razed Kiovia, the chief city of the Rutheni, and Batu, their captain, wasted Polonia, Silesia, Moravia, and Hungary. So, of course, these are all very old names. They're wasting Eastern Europe, and they're making their way into Europe. And at this time, Europe was terrified. There were many poems and stuff written about this. There was one French king who wrote to his wife saying, "If we don't send them back to Tartarus, then they will send us to heaven." Obviously meaning because we will die. It says, Pope Innocent IV, amazed with the tempest of these invasions, in the year 1242, sent certain friars of the orders of Dominic and Francis to the court of the Great Sham to entreat peace for the Christians. So there is a lot of debate here. I've talked about this before. There's a conspiracy that basically the Pope gave up Europe in this year and said we will be tributary to the Tartarians, but he didn't tell anyone. So, to the Europeans, for some reason, the Mongols just stopped. They just stopped, and there were stories that Batu Khan drowned in a river, and etc., while he was trying to invade Austria. But there were rumours that the Pope and other kings of Europe had managed to get this successful treaty down, which essentially said, we will give you whatever you want, just please don't ruin Europe. And then they hid it from the Europeans, because they didn't want them to know. So the Catholic Church then started gathering all the things, the tribute. So the Catholic Church went around gathering the tribute under the guise of Catholicism and then handing it to the Sham and saying, thank you, please don't destroy us. And that carried on, supposedly, until about the 1500s when they secretly developed much better weapons because the Mongols had primitive guns. Well, we'll consider primitive, but at the time they were modern guns, but they were primitive guns. And the Europeans latched onto this and secretly developed much better weapons, and they came back with muskets, and that turned the tide. So there's a big conspiracy there that I'm not advocating for it. I'm just telling it you. I do enjoy it, but I won't put all my chips on anything yet. The circuit of this empire in the times about spoke of stretched from the uttermost bounds of Asia to Armenia and from Bengala to Volga. Their incursions pierced even to Nilus and Danubius, so even to the Nile. So they got even to Egypt. And this is again something that's debated this day. They'll say the Mongols never got to Egypt, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Tamerlane, in particular, was fighting in Egypt against the Mamluks. So then it just talks about the Roman and Macedonian empires never being as good because they were just too into politics, they weren't into invading, saying that Tartars were much better at that. After the empire fell, it became divided into many principalities, yet so that the title and majesty of the empire remained always to the Great Sham. So you see, it's not really fallen. All these smaller nations are still paying tribute to the Great Sham, who, as we said before, took the original of this name for the Great Shangus. So this is talking about the modern. So here it's talking about Genghis's empire. When it fell, it broke into a lot smaller kingdoms, but these are still subject to the Great Empire and the Sham. And this is in, late 1500s, early 1600s. At this day, this empire reacheth from the desert Lop on the one side and the lake of Kitavia on the other to the famous wall of China, situated between 43 and 45 degrees. So there you go. That can easily tell you where this empire is today, between the desert of Lop and the wall of China. So when I say today, of course, 1600s. So that's where the empire was. Desert of Lop to the wall of China, which leadeth from the mountain to mountain till it end at the ocean, and divideth the Tartars from the Chinese, of course, the Great Wall of China that's talking about. And it says from the Scythian Ocean to the confines of Tapura and the bordering regions. So, of course, it's saying it extends north as well. That makes sense with what we know, because the Muscovites hadn't invaded as far into Siberia yet. So when we say it's between the Lop and China, it goes all the way up to the Northern Ocean. That's what they're saying. Not me. That's what they're saying. It goes all the way to the Northern Ocean. And it contains many mighty kingdoms, such as Tangut, with names some of the cities. If you want to pause and have a look at the cities, we've discussed this before, so we don't need to go too deep into them or anything, but, names of places like Tibet that we know, Kampian, Ergamor, Karazhan. In the midst of the empire is Tenduk, which talked about before, which in the time of Marco Polo was in the jurisdiction of Prester John, but now is subdued by the Great Sham. So the Great Sham has Tenduc in 1600. Remember that when Marco Polo visited, it was about 1290. So a good 300 years before this, but now it's possessed by the Great Sham. The greater part of the people were Christians, the residue are Mahometans, but the Christians are Nestorian Christians, which matches the Nestorian kingdom stuff that we hear from Marco Polo. Here is the city Kambalu. Again, we've talked about this so much, but they will tell you today that Kambalu is Beijing, and that's the lies. That really is. This is nonsense. It's complete lies, honestly. Kambalu is its own place. I'm pretty certain I know where it is, in Manchuria. We'll talk about it on another video. It's definitely in Manchuria. It was north of the wall. It's not Beijing. And it talks about Taiduk as well, which is situated on a lake. Place called Zandu, which they call Shangdu today, so I'm not sure if that is the right one, but it could be very easily. It does seem to be a good place. It was like a summer palace. So Shangdu being 4 square, every square containing 8 miles and 4 gates. So again, just talking about the dimensions of the place that I don't think we need to go into too much. Talks about the walls and the palace. If you'd like to read this, just pause, have a quick read. And it talks about the whole region, for the most part, being very populous, full of towns, rich and civil. So, of course, this is north of the Wall of China that it's talking about. It's north of the Wall of China. And it says that the Tartars, choosing this for their country, beautified it with the spoils of Asia, China, and that part of Europe, which they had harried. And they were never woon or taken from thence again to this day. So they never moved. They chose that place as their country, and they beautified it with the spoils of Asia and China. Then it goes on to name some of the lakes and the provinces, which you discuss, and some of the stuff that's found there, like hemp and rhubarb and musk, ginger, cinnamon, cloves. In rivers, they found many grains of gold. And then in Cathay, a coin is current made of the black rind of a certain tree growing between the body. So when it says current, is in currency. So in Cathay, they're using a coin made of the black rind of a certain tree. So, wow, it's quite interesting that is the coin, and it's stamped with the image of the Great Sham. And that ties into another thing that I've heard, that supposedly instead of use metal or worthy metals in their coins like other places would, these guys would use things like trees, because they wanted all the gold, so they stored all the gold back in their palace, and that's supposedly why all the European empires wanted to invade so bad, because they knew there was just stores and stores of gold hidden underneath these palaces, because they were using, tree trunks and banknotes. In fact, they used leather banknotes as well, instead of actual physical gold. And in Europe, they were staring at them very jealous, like, wait, we didn't know you could do that. And as well, they made salt and pepper. So if you ever have salt and pepper chicken from the Chinese, you're actually in salt and pepper Tartarian chicken. Ain't Chinese, it's Tartarian. I might be being a bit hyperbolic there. But yeah, the rest of this just does talk about food, mainly about the food and stuff that you can find, cattle, milk, wool, stuff that they make. Here it does say, for the most part, all of the nations of the Tartars who are not subject to the Great Sham fight on horseback. So that's interesting. That the ones that are not subject to the Great Sham, so remember that there are Tartars not subject to the Great Sham, and they fight on horseback. Their weapons are the bow and arrow, with which they fight very desperately. Their tents are made of woven wool, under which they keep in foul weather. So yeah, these are the ones we know, the ones that they talk about moving around, the ones that are not subject to the Great Sham, and nomadic lifestyles. Down here it says, beside these things which Marco Polo writeth, certain Englishmen sailing by the Muscovite Sea, so that's the north, and the bordering regions have pierced even to Cathay, and have set down many memorable matters of this prince, whom the Muscovite terms the Caesar of Cathay, and the Turk of Uluchan, that is, the great prince. So that's very interesting. I've never heard that one before, reading that in this book, that supposedly Englishmen have sailed all the way to Cathay and have stories of the Caesar of Cathay, as the Russians call him, because of course they use the Tsar, the Caesar, and not without reason, for in magnificence of courts, amplines of dominion, abundance of treasure, and number of soldiers, he goeth far beyond all the kings and potentates of Asia, and reigneth in such majesty that his subjects foolishly call him the shadow of spirits and the son of the immortal God. So that's very curious there. His people call him the shadow of spirits and the son of the immortal God. And notice how The abundance of treasure. So I wonder why the Europeans went over and destroyed this place. Because the abundance of treasure, the great courts, there was so much to be had over there. Their justice, he says, he maintaineth justice with admirable severity. For the first offence, he will grievously whip the offender, but for every other offence, he's cut into pieces by the middle. I presume you'd only be making one more offence after that. It talks about the Tartar and his form of government, apparently using astrologians in great request in those provinces. Marco Polo writeth in the city of Kembalu of 50,000, and when Kublai Khan understood that the city would rebel against him, he caused another to be built near to it, called Taindu, containing 24 miles, besides the suburbs. And there's also great stores of fortune tellers, and I don't think I can say that word. Negromancers? Am I about to be demonetized? Maybe? But yeah, those things are in the King's Palace of Zandu, and also in China. And Zandu, of course, is north of the wall anyway, so... There's as part of the Arabians inhabit cities and are called Moors. So, of course, yeah, when the Arabians are in the cities, they are known as the Moors, and they part live in the fields and mountains and are termed Badouins. So some of these people dwell in cities as the Cathayans, Bokhars, and those of Samarkand. So, of course, it seems like the city-dwelling people are those more of the middle regions. The further north you go, the more nomadic the people seem to be, and the more they seem to live by the season change, which makes sense. If Siberia is getting colder in the winter, then I guess you probably want to move south, wouldn't you? So then it goes on to talk about the Tartars, which are further on in the northeast. So it says the ones far situated from the residue, the ones inhabiting the remote Scythian areas, which Pliny calleth Taban, which is lying upon the Strait of Anion. Some people think that's the Bering Strait today, but again, like I talked earlier, there is some debates about exactly where these things are. But these people are also dispersed into diverse hordes, wandering up and down the country, and in a manner, they are all subject to the Great Sham of Cathay. So it's telling you that everything northeast, so that real far northeast Siberian area, that was still, in a manner, subject to the Great Sham. It goes on to say that certain writers say that these hordes come from the 10 tribes of Israel, which were sent into captivity by Salmanasar, king of Africa, beyond the Caspian Mountains. In remembrance whereof until this day, they retain the name of their tribes, the title of Hebrews, and circumcision. In all other rites, they follow the fashions of the Tartarians. So I like that. Tartarians right there. So I just enjoy when I see that word written in these books. I don't know why. It's a beautiful word, much better than Mongolian. Wait, is that racist? Maybe I should cut that. And then the last part talks about the king Tabor, who says came out of these areas to try and turn people to Judaism. The king of France in particular tried to turn the king of France to Judaism, and then Charles V, who was the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, he burnt him at the stake in 1540 in Mantua. So if you want to learn more about that, we do have a video on Tabor that has some information on who that might have been, where it came from, etc. So anyway, that was a pretty long video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. It was a bit more old school, back to the way we used to do things. That was how the Jesuits, or this particular Jesuit, who was kicked out of the Jesuit order. So again, what do you want to make of that? Was he Jesuit? Was he not? But this information is what he wrote down and believed and was translated into English regarding Tartaria in the 1600s. And I think it gives us a great view of what the people believed at that time. And it's a great point to make an analysis from, to try and view the differences in how this empire grew and shrank in such a short period of time, and how it's been hidden today in certain areas, particularly in Siberia and Manchuria. So anyway, leave a comment down below if you enjoyed. If you want to support the channel, there's a few ways you can do so. You can drop super chats, whatever that is. Join the channel memberships, Patreon, buy me a coffee, etc. If you do any of those things, you can join the Discord server, which is private. So that's pretty cool. You can come talk to me and see how we do research. It's pretty unimpressive, I'll be honest, but it's fun anyway. So like and subscribe if you haven't already. Please share with your friends and your family until they block your phone number. We've also got a Reddit and an Instagram, so if you do Reddit, go join the Reddit, because you can post your own stuff there, post your own research, and we're trying to grow the community. It's completely free, just go do that thing. Other than that, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Ancient Historia.